They found the generals at dawn, all 5 of them, laid out in the dirt outside the Persian camp, with their throats cut, still wearing the clothes they'd walked in with the night before under a flag of truce. 13,000 Greek soldiers stood and stared at the bodies and understood, in the way that only soldiers can understand, that everything had just changed. No leaders, no patron, no way home that anyone had thought of yet, just open enemy land in every direction, and a Persian Empire that had just demonstrated very clearly what its promises were worth. One man near the back of the crowd, a veteran infantryman named Doros, 41 years old, built like a door, quiet in the way that men become quiet after too many campaigns, dropped to one knee in the dirt. Not from exhaustion, not from grief. Something else was moving through him, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy sitting on a cold stone floor while his father read aloud by lamplight. A line, just a line. He couldn't even remember the full passage, only 7 words that arrived without invitation, without explanation, in the middle of all that chaos and blood and open sky. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed. He didn't know why those words came to him at that exact moment. He didn't know what they were going to cost him to believe, but something shifted in his chest, quiet, almost imperceptible, like a door opening somewhere deep in a dark house. That feeling saved 13,000 lives. This is how it happened. The march had started clean. That's always how betrayal works. It doesn't announce itself. It walks beside you for weeks, eats your food, sleeps near your fire, waits for the exact moment when the distance behind you is too great to cross back. They'd left Sardis in spring, 13,000 Greek mercenaries, following a Persian prince named Cyrus, who had ambition burning behind his eyes like a fever he'd decided to stop treating. He told them it was a border campaign. A regional governor had grown too powerful, too bold. A few weeks of hard marching, one clean engagement, and back home with full purses before the harvest. The veterans didn't fully believe it, but the pay was real and the road was clear, so they marched. They kept marching even when the distances stopped making sense, when the rivers grew too wide, when towns became fewer and the horizon kept pulling away like it was running from them. Veterans traded quiet glances around the campfires, but said nothing loud enough to matter. And Cyrus kept driving them east, past every landmark that should have told a careful man to start asking harder questions. At the Euphrates, he finally told them the truth. He wasn't fighting a governor. He was marching to take the throne from his own brother, the king of Persia, the most powerful man on earth. The Greeks exploded. Curses in every dialect, spears driven into dirt, men who had survived plague and battle and Spartan discipline, standing in Mesopotamian heat, furious at how completely they'd been played. Doros was among the loudest. He'd crossed half the world on a lie, and the man who told it was standing in front of him smiling, offering triple wages, offering plunder, offering everything except the one thing that actually mattered, a reason to trust him. They marched anyway, because what else do you do when the road home is longer than the road forward? Mesopotamia tried to kill them before any enemy did. Heat that rose not just from the sun, but from the ground, from the air, from inside your own armor. Pack animals collapsed and stayed down. Men who had marched through mountain winters stumbled on flat, open plains. Water went warm the moment you drew it. The column moved like something already wounded, slow, stubborn, bleeding sweat, while Cyrus drove them toward a collision only he could clearly imagine. That collision came at Cunaxa, on a vast plain north of Babylon. The Persian royal army stretched across the ground in numbers that made even experienced men go quiet. Somewhere in that mass of iron and cavalry and war elephants was the king himself. The Greeks formed up the way they always had, locked shields, lowered spears, voices rising together, and when the signal came, they advanced. The Persians opposite them broke, just shattered and ran. For one blazing, perfect moment, 13,000 mercenaries had beaten the greatest empire on earth. Then word swept through them like a cold wind. Cyrus was dead. He'd spotted his brother in the center, charged straight at him, reached him, wounded him, and then a javelin found his face. He was dead before he hit the ground. The Greeks had won their battle and lost the entire point of it in the same afternoon. They reformed on a field they just swept clean and tried to understand what had happened to their world. No patron, no plan, no obvious route home. Just open Persian land on every side and an empire that now had every reason to make sure none of them left it. Tissaphernes, a Persian commander, came with an offer: safe passage north, supplied roads, an escort to the frontier. The Greeks didn't trust him, but distrust is a position, not a plan. They had no cavalry, no maps, no allies they could name, so they accepted, weapons ready, eyes never fully closed, and began marching north under a peace that felt like a rope slowly tightening. Weeks passed, Persians and Greeks moving together, smiling the way men smile when both sides know exactly what the other is thinking, and neither is ready to say it out loud. Every day without betrayal made the next day more suspicious. The veterans kept their hands near their swords and their trust locked somewhere deep and inaccessible. Then Tissaphernes invited the Greek generals to his tent for a parley. 5 commanders walked in under a flag of truce. None walked out. Word reached the Greek camp after dark and moved through it the way fire moves through dry grass. The noise that followed was not the sound of soldiers preparing. It was 13,000 people discovering that the thing holding them together had just been cut out from underneath them. Doros sat in the dark with his back against a wagon wheel and pressed both hands flat on the cold ground and breathed. Around him, the camp fractured, men running without direction, officers shouting questions that had no answers. He closed his eyes, and underneath all of it, underneath the panic and the cold and the specific weight of understanding that no rescue was coming, that line returned again, quieter this time, almost gentle. If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move. He sat with it, a man who had never been particularly religious, sitting in the dark in the middle of a collapsing army in the center of a hostile empire, holding 7 words like a coal in his hands, not because he was certain they were true, because the alternative, the other voice, the one saying this is where it ends, was a voice he had decided somewhere in the last 10 seconds he was not going to let win. He stood up, found the surviving officers, and they did the only thing left to do. They called the men together and told them the truth with nothing softened and nothing hidden. No rescue was coming. No Persian general was going to feel guilty enough to let them go. The only people who were going to save these 13,000 men were these 13,000 men. Burn what you cannot carry. Elect leaders in the dark. Make north a direction. Move. At dawn, they burned the wagons. Watching everything heavy and comfortable turn to ash is not a logistical decision. It's a funeral for the version of yourself that still thought this was going to be easy. The flames went up slow, then fast, and the Greeks stood watching in silence, and then they turned north and started walking. Tissaphernes followed, but not the way anyone expected. He had no interest in a pitched battle with veteran infantry who had just beaten his own army 2 weeks earlier. He sent cavalry instead, mounted archers who swept along the edges of the column, fired from beyond spear range, and vanished before infantry could answer. Men died not in clean, decisive moments, but in the slow, cruel arithmetic of harassment. An arrow in the neck, a stumble, a man too exhausted to keep pace who was simply gone the next time you looked. The Greeks adapted. They formed a hollow square, shields outward on all sides, wounded and supplies in the center, and marched inside that moving fortress while arrows clattered against bronze and flesh. When Persian riders grew careless and pressed too close, they burst outward in a sharp, hard counterattack that reminded the enemy patience was not the same as weakness. The Persians pulled back, changed tactics, started burning the land ahead instead. Crops, villages, water sources stripped bare so the column walked into nothing, herding them north, towards the mountains.
The Carduchian Mountains were not a barrier. They were an enemy with altitude on its side. The tribes who lived in those high passes had never submitted to Persia and wanted no part of any foreign army regardless of origin. They attacked from ridgelines and hidden ledges with arrows and stones and the intimate deadly knowledge of men defending ground they had memorized since childhood. On open plains, the Greek phalanx was near unstoppable. In those narrow passes, it was almost meaningless. The column stretched into a thin, vulnerable line, men cut off around bends, men dying in spaces too tight to retrieve their own dead. The rearguard bled constantly. The front searched desperately for any route not already sealed.
At one choke point, the path ahead was completely blocked. Carduchians holding the heights, a frontal assault and obvious massacre. So under darkness and rain and fog so thick a man couldn't see past his own arm, Doros volunteered to lead a flanking detachment up the cliff face. Up the actual cliff, in the dark, in the rain, without torches. They climbed by feel, hands finding cracks in wet stone, men pulling each other upward in silence, communicating in the absence of sound. Some slipped, some were caught by the men below, some disappeared into the dark without a sound and were not heard from again. Doros climbed until his hands bled and his shoulders burned, and his mind wanted to argue with his body about whether this was physically possible. He didn't let it argue. He thought instead about a mountain, about what it means to tell a mountain to move when you are the smallest, most exhausted, most outgunned version of yourself imaginable. And he understood, not as doctrine, not as theology, just as a thing a man understands at the edge of his own capacity, that faith was never about the mountain being small. It was about moving anyway when the mountain was enormous. One handhold, one breath, one impossible foot of wet stone at a time. They reached the top before dawn. When they charged down from behind at first light, the defenders broke. The pass opened. The army moved through, battered and diminished, but moving, which was all that had ever separated them from dying where they stood. Armenia waited on the other side, and Armenia meant winter. The plateau was high and open, and the cold struck them like something deliberate, like the land itself had made a decision. Snow drove sideways. Wind found every gap in armor and clothing. Men from Mediterranean coastlines who had spent months praying for shade discovered a different enemy, one that killed not with violence, but with gentleness, offering warmth that wasn't there, rest that didn't end. A blizzard hit the column at altitude and broke it apart. Units lost contact. Men wandered off the path and disappeared into white. The wounded fell behind. Officers moved through the storm, hauling men to their feet, shouting, striking, forcing them forward, because anyone who sat down in that snow was not going to get up, and that was not a figure of speech. They found Armenian houses buried under the drifts, underground dwellings warm inside, stocked with grain and livestock. For 8 days, the Greeks stopped, ate until it hurt, slept without fear of immediate attack, thawed hands and feet that had stopped registering sensation. When they moved again, they were quieter, harder, stripped of everything non-essential. Survival had edited them down to something durable and simple. Keep moving, stay together, trust no offer you cannot enforce. More hills, more skirmishes, more men left behind in ground too cold for proper burial, and then, slowly, passed from mouth to mouth through the column like something too fragile to say loudly, a rumor, a sea, to the north, Greek cities on its shore, the Black Sea. They followed guides toward a mountain from which it was said the water could be seen. The air changed before anything else, a quality to it, a faint salted edge that men raised near harbors recognized without being told what it was. They climbed anyway, quietly, not wanting to trust it. They had seen too many things that looked like hope and weren't. Doros was with the rear guard when the sound reached him. It started somewhere above and rolled down the mountain, gathering voices as it fell. Thousands of men taking up the same 2 words, until the sound of it was less like shouting and more like something the mountain itself was saying. The sea, the sea. He ran the last stretch, And when he reached the summit, and it was there, blue and enormous and impossible in the morning light below them, he stopped, just stopped. Men around him were weeping without embarrassment. Veterans who had held their faces blank through ambush and betrayal and blizzard, standing on a mountaintop with tears cutting through the dirt on their faces. Doros looked at the water for a long time. He thought about every mountain they had moved, not metaphorically, actually moved, through, around, over, by the specific and unglamorous work of one step in front of the next, when every reasonable part of you was arguing for surrender. He thought about a cold stone floor and a father reading by lampland and 7 words he'd carried across half the world without knowing he was carrying them. He hadn't moved mountains by faith alone. He knew that. Men had bled for every inch of this. Men had died. Good men. Men whose names deserved to be remembered in languages that would never know them. But somewhere in the worst of it, in the dark on the cliff face, in the blizzard, in the moment after the generals were murdered and the camp fell apart, something had steadied him. Something quiet and persistent and entirely unreasonable. A seed of a thing, too small to explain, too stubborn to die. He understood now what his father had meant. Not that faith makes the mountain disappear. The mountain is real. The mountain is always real. Faith is what makes you take the first step toward it anyway, and then the next, and then the one after that, until one morning you're standing on the other side looking at the sea, and the mountain is behind you, and you're still alive, and that, just that, is the miracle. Of the 13,000 Greeks who marched east from Sardis for a paycheck, roughly 8,600 reached the coast. The rest are folded into the soil of places that never gave back what they took. Those who survived were not the same men who had left. Something had been burned away in them. Not just the wagons, not just the softness, but the belief that survival is something that happens to you. They learned, at a cost most people will never be asked to pay, that it is something you choose, moment by moment, step by step, in the dark, on a wet cliff face, with bleeding hands and no guarantee of the top. They reached Trapezus, a Greek city on the Black Sea coast, and were welcomed and fed and given room to simply exist without immediate threat of death. Some of them raced on the beach, competed in wrestling, laughed, actually laughed, which is a sound that takes on a completely different weight when you understand how close it came to never happening again. The road home still had teeth. A few more skirmishes waited along the coast. Survival stories are rarely neat at the edges, but the central fact held. They had been surrounded, they had been betrayed, they had been left without leaders in the center of an empire that wanted them dead. And they had moved through every mountain in their way, stone, snow, and despair, and the worst kind of cold, on nothing more than each other, and something small and stubborn and quietly impossible that refused all the way to the sea to stop believing the other side existed.